Sandra Bullock stood quietly in the first-class line at LAX, dressed in relaxed travel wear and a simple baseball cap. Despite her understated presence, she still managed to catch the attention of a woman in high-end designer clothing, who couldn't seem to hide her disapproving glances. This woman, covered in luxury brands from head to toe, whispered something to her companion while pointing at Sandra's casual attire. What happened next? It left the entire first-class cabin in stunned silence and delivered an unforgettable lesson about what true class really means. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you love real stories about celebrities who remain humble despite their fame, make sure to subscribe to our channel, because tomorrow, we have another heartwarming story that will touch your soul. LAX buzzed with its usual chaos, the rolling of luggage, hurried conversations, and overhead airport announcements echoing through the terminal. Inside the exclusive first-class lounge, Sandra Bullock sat quietly in a corner, fully absorbed in a well-worn paperback. She wore simple black leggings, an oversized sweater, and comfortable running shoes, the kind of practical choice someone makes when they value comfort over appearances on a long flight. Her face, makeup-free, radiated the natural beauty that had captivated audiences for years. But today, she seemed perfectly content to blend into the background. On the other side of the lounge, however, sat Margaret Winchester, a woman impossible to ignore. Her Hermes bag occupied its own seat, her diamond jewelry sparkled under the bright airport lights, and her meticulously styled hair suggested hours spent in a high-end salon. She didn't just belong in first class, she carried herself as if she owned it. Margaret's eyes landed on Sandra, and her perfectly lined lips curled into a subtle sneer. She leaned toward her companion, her voice just loud enough to be overheard. "Can you believe who they're letting into first class these days? I remember when this lounge had standards." Her words lingered in the air like an overpowering perfume, impossible to ignore. Sandra, who had heard plenty of similar comments throughout her career, simply turned another page in her book. Her calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to Margaret's obvious attempt to draw attention. The tension in the lounge was almost tangible as other passengers stole curious glances between the two women. But what no one noticed. A man in a simple black jacket had just entered the lounge, his kind eyes quietly observing the scene unfold. His presence would soon turn this seemingly ordinary flight into an unforgettable lesson in dignity and real class. As the first-class passengers began boarding, Margaret positioned herself directly behind Sandra in line, her Louis Vuitton carry-on trailing behind her like a peacock flaunting its feathers. "First class?" Margaret's voice dripped with mock surprise as she caught a glimpse of Sandra's boarding pass. "Well, isn't that interesting?" Sandra turned slightly, offering the same polite smile that had charmed millions on screen. But Margaret wasn't finished. Loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear, she continued, "You know, I remember when flying first class meant something. When people actually dressed for the occasion." She gestured to her own Chanel suit with a self-satisfied smirk. Sandra simply adjusted her baseball cap, her expression remaining serene despite the clear provocation. As fate would have it, their seats were directly across the aisle from each other. When Sandra placed her simple backpack in the overhead compartment, Margaret let out an exaggerated sigh. "Darling," she called out, her voice sweet as honey, but sharp with venom. "I think you might have wandered into the wrong section. Economy is further back." A few passengers shifted awkwardly in their seats, while others pretended to be engrossed in their phones. Sandra, unfazed, settled into her seat with grace, pulling out her book once again. Her refusal to engage seemed to irritate Margaret even more. Margaret sighed dramatically, adjusting her designer scarf with unnecessary precision. "It's just that some of us work very hard to maintain certain standards," she said, ensuring her voice carried through the cabin. "We pay a premium for a premium experience, though I suppose not everyone understands that concept." The flight attendant, who had been keeping a close eye on the exchange, approached with the pre-flight drink service. At that moment, the man in the black jacket, the one who had been observing from the lounge, made his way down the aisle. He paused briefly, his eyes meeting Sandra's. A subtle, knowing smile passed between them. Margaret, too engrossed in her performance, completely missed this silent exchange, the one that was about to turn her carefully constructed world upside down. The plane had barely reached cruising altitude when Margaret decided to escalate things further. Sipping her champagne with exaggerated elegance, she turned to her companion and, in a voice loud enough for the entire cabin to hear, declared, "You know, Sarah, I was just telling Harrison at the country club standards have fallen everywhere. First class used to actually mean first class." She shot a pointed glance at Sandra. "Now, it seems anyone can wander in wearing whatever they picked up at Target." Sandra sighed quietly, placing a bookmark in her novel before finally turning to face Margaret. Her expression remained gentle, but her eyes held a quiet strength that made several passengers lean forward in anticipation. "You seem very concerned with appearances," Sandra said softly, her voice carrying warmth, making Margaret's coldness all the more obvious. Margaret's carefully maintained smile flickered, but she quickly recovered. "Well, someone has to maintain standards. I've worked too hard to sit here and watch everything go to." She stopped mid-sentence, because right then, the man in the black jacket rose from his seat a few rows ahead. As he turned, several passengers gasped. Keanu Reeves. He strolled down the aisle with that same quiet grace he was famous for and stopped directly between Sandra and Margaret. "Hey, Sandy," he said with a warm smile. "Thought I recognized you at the gate." Margaret's face froze mid-sneer as Keanu leaned down to give Sandra a friendly hug. "Keanu, I didn't know you were on this flight," Sandra responded, genuinely pleased. The entire cabin sat in stunned silence as the two old friends shared a moment of effortless familiarity. Margaret's champagne glass trembled in her hand. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She had spent the entire flight trying to belittle Sandra Bullock, one of Hollywood's most beloved actresses. And now, she was being watched by Keanu Reeves himself. Keanu turned to Margaret, his expression kind yet firm. "You know," he said, his voice calm but commanding, "I couldn't help but overhear your thoughts on standards." He let the words hang in the air before continuing. "But in my experience, true class has nothing to do with what we wear or how much we pay for a ticket." Margaret's manicured hand clenched her champagne glass tighter. As the plane landed, she finally stood, her voice trembling. "Miss Bullock, Mr. Reeves, I owe you an apology. My behavior was inexcusable." Sandra smiled gently. "We all have moments we're not proud of. What matters is what we learn from them." Keanu nodded. "Sometimes, the biggest lessons come from the most uncomfortable moments." And just like that, the entire first-class cabin had learned an unforgettable truth. Real class has nothing to do with money and everything to do with how you treat others.